Hi, Benji.
Hey, Michael, how's it going?
Good, good. Was just going through the agenda, leading into the topic.
It's a busy one, but it's not over time, at least on what's scheduled.
Oh, yeah, let's see about that.
Hello, guys.
Hey, Roman.
Hi.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, Tim, how's it going?
Hi, Tim.
Oh. Hey, Michael.
Hi.
Hi, Lauren.
Hi.
Hey, friends.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Lee. Can we get the Google Doc up, please?
Oh man, forgot this time. Yep, working on it right now. All right, I'll put it in the chat first so you can get started, and then I'll put it in the agenda file next for posterity. I think I got everyone's pull requests merged. Just let me know if you still got one.
I'm about to send one. Sorry about that.
No problem at all. I sorted attendees by alphabetical order in case you're going to add one there. All right. All right, Docs Note is live. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the July 2022 edition of the GraphQL Working Group meeting. We'll call things to order. Of course, everyone here joining means that we've all agreed to the spec membership agreement, participation guidelines, contribution guide, and code of conduct. Links to all of those are in the top of the agenda file as per usual. I will drop a link to the agenda just in case. That way we make sure everybody's got the same thing. They're looking at the same thing. A couple have late changes went in there. So give it a quick reload if you haven't. Okay, so as we always do, first, let's do just a quick round the room of names to faces so that we all know who we're all talking to. And then we'll do an overview of our agenda. So I'll kick us off. My name is Lee, working for the GraphQL Foundation here, representing the meeting. And then I've sorted everybody else by alphabetical order. Hopefully that helps doing the intros. So Adron, I think that lets you go first. If Adron is here. Which he's not here yet. So Alex, if you're here. Not yet. Oh, Alex is literally joining this second. Alex, welcome, my friend. We literally just started intros and I called on you the instant you joined. So.
Oh, sweet. Great. Yeah, hey, I'm Alex. I'm at Pronto AI.
That leads it to you, Andrew.
Hey, I'm Andrew from TakeShape.
Hey everyone, Benji from GraphQL.
Hello, I'm Benoit from Apollo.
Devon here.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. Hi, Ivan from Apollo.
This is Greg from Intuit.
Is Lauren here?
Yeah, hi. I'm Lauren from the Guild.
Hi, I'm Matt.
I am Michael from Chili Cream.
I don't see Nick.
Hi, I'm Nick from Amazon. Sorry, I was.
I see you've got your handle.
Hey, I'm Rob, also at Take Shape with Andrew.
Rob from First Dibs.
I am Roman, Microsoft.
Sahaj, are you there?
Oh, yeah. Hi.
Hey everyone, I'm Sasha from Twitter.
And I don't know if I see Stefano.
Stefano's here, but we also got another Steve ST from Netflix coming.
Hi, Tim. This is Steven from Netflix.
Yeah, Steven. And I'm Tim from Stellite.
And I don't see Jakob on the call yet, but hopefully he joins later because he's got some agenda items. Did we miss anybody?
Cohen from Indeed.
Welcome.
And I'm John from IBM.
Welcome. Did we get everybody? I think so. Awesome. Well, for folks that you don't have your name on the attendee list, please send a pull request. We'll get you merged. It's a good way to keep track of who's attending all of our meetings. Okay. I can see in our notes file that there's already some awesome action. Of course, Benji always does us a great service by leading our note taking, but if others could volunteer to help out, especially since some of the things being discussed today, Benji's going to be doing some talking. So talking and note taking at the same time, pretty hard to do. Anyone willing to volunteer to help out Benji with note taking?
Happy to volunteer.
That's great. Okay, let's take a quick review of our agenda. As a note, so we did this last time. We took a quick break halfway through. I thought that was well needed and went well. So we're going to do that again. And as a means to help keep ourselves on time, rather than breaking at the hour and trying to come back at some moment, what we'll do is break about 5 minutes before the hour. That way at the hour, we know what time we need to be back to get things started again. Hopefully it'll help keep us on time. But we have a healthy set of things to talk about today. So we're going to talk about directives on extended enum values, meta fields, and sounds like that'll be a healthy discussion. We have some counter arguments to that as well. Formally allowing recursion on resolve abstract values. An update from the GraphQL over HTTP working group. Sounds great. And a discussion on some previous topics around GraphQL definitions, order of chapters and algorithms, updates and discussion on defer and stream, and what sounds like a recursive algorithm, perhaps something around structs RFCs from Benji. Sounds like fun. Anything or not listed here that we ought to talk about today? Silence is golden. That means we've got the full list. Okay, before we dig into all of that, let's briefly take a look at open action items we have from previous meetings. I'm just going to pop open some of these links myself. I think we have one that is ready for review, which was our final editorial review of the deprecation of input values. And this one, I believe, was completed. It is. Okay. So this was one that we had an approved or accepted RFC. And between the last meeting and this meeting, I went through, did a bunch of editorial changes and got that one merged. So that one's now in the draft spec. So closing that issue. That was the only one that was marked as ready for review. We do have a handful of open actions from previous meetings though. Some historical, I think we don't need to go through all of these live, but especially for the most recently opened ones from May. Anyone have updates on any of those? And then Benji, did we have actions come out of the June meeting? Do you know?
It's possible that I forgot to file them, but I'm not sure.
Okay. I didn't see any filed. It's entirely possible that we just didn't have any specific actions come out of the meeting. So the other two that were open as part of the May meeting, Rob, one of these was on you, the stream and defer, the spec wording being accurate about index formatting. Is that something that you feel good about? That was, I think, feedback from 2 sessions ago.
Yeah, I think my spec PR is slightly behind where we're at right now, and there's a few more open questions I hope that we could resolve today, and then after that I'll get everything up to date and ready for review.
Okay, I'm gonna mark this one as closed then, since
Okay.
discussion will help us yield through that, and we don't need an action item for you to know that the spec text needs to eventually be accurate.
There was one action item, but I believe that that's been acted upon. It was for Roman to file the pull requests, which he has done. So I'll file it later, but I'll just then close it straight away.
That reminder, yeah, and that was good. I ended up pulling on that thread and having a handful of bigger editorial changes, so that was a good spark. I think some of those are still open, but that's okay. We're making progress. The other one here was about pulling feedback for client-controlled nullability. Alex, do you feel like you got the feedback that you needed relative to that action?
So I think that one was to open up a thread so that we could get community feedback, like as people start using it. I haven't done that yet. We don't have a release of client control nullability, but I can do. It's okay if I do a quick update on where we're at.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, cool. Yeah, so there's a PR open for validation. Parsing and lexing has been merged into the main branch. It's not out in a release yet, but it's there. I'm no longer at Yelp, so I'm not going to be working on this full time, but I'm going to see it through. I'm going to finish out client control nullability. It just might be a tad slower, especially right now as I get ramped up in my new job. So I'm going to do discussions on error handling, and then I think there's some concerns around null propagation still. We were talking with Benji and some of the folks from Meta about that. So I'll do those discussions sometime in the next couple working group meetings.
Sweet. On that itself, so that when we come back to it, eventually I'll remember what we just talked about. Thank you for the update. Hopefully your next thing is exciting, by the way.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks.
Okay. We still have some historical open actions, but I think we can let those sit for now and try to take a pass at reviewing some of those outside of the meeting. Okay. With respect to time, let's get things going into the main business here. Is Benoit here and ready to take over for directives on extended enum values?
Yep. Let me share my screen. All right. Oops. Yes, so directives on extended enum values. I'll try to be quick, but just a bit of context. I work on Apollo Kotlin. It's a library that generates code. And so on the left, you see the declaration of a very simple enum. On the right, that's the equivalent code that the library generates. No issue here, but of course, as soon as you use some certain reserved keywords, you may generate code that doesn't compile anymore. The solution is pretty straightforward. Just escape any reserved word in the generated code. That works, but that's not completely ideal because on the call site, it's a bit annoying to use. It's a bit less easy to read. Lots of backticks in Kotlin. That's the syntax to escape reserved words. And so wouldn't it be nice if the user instead could choose the name to use in the generated code? And we try as much as possible to actually use GraphQL as a way to configure things in the library. And so that's what we came up with. You extend your enum and you use a directive called target name to specify the name you want to use in the generated code. So here, for instance, int value instead of int. Enum with a capital E, that fixes also the problem. But the issue is that's not actually valid with the current version of the spec, because the spec will, at least not the spec, but the parsers that implement the spec will have the impression that you are trying to redefine a value that already exists in the original enum. Whereas that's not what you're trying to do here. You're trying to add a directive on an existing value. And that's basically it. The proposal here is to actually make the spec evolve to allow this syntax, and or maybe actually to allow this, but maybe with a different syntax if there's any potential problem or issue that I haven't foreseen. That's why I'm here to gather some feedback on this. Can we go ahead with this, or is there any potential issue? I think at the very least, we should keep the current rule to not redefine an existing value. Because if you're trying to do that, there's probably an issue, and it's very good to fail fast. Also, if we go ahead, I think we should probably disallow like adding a directive that's already there and the original value, unless of course it's repeatable. But yeah, other than that, that's basically it. Any feedback is very welcome on this, and yeah, that's it, I guess. Thank you.
Feedback for Benoit.
I mean, we are using that also like in schema stitching, that you can add kind of directives to fields that exist on an existing schema. So I didn't mind. We have our own parser, so we could easily do that.
Yeah, this kind of fits to, like, this is a deeper issue with schema extensions, where what you're really trying to express here is a schema union, right? You're trying to say we can recursively merge the schemas down, and our current schema extensions are basically we never merge. So like I can't add an argument on an existing field either. So that's the same problem. And it's unclear whether schema extensions, like we could just change the schema extension syntax to just be, you can put an extend in front of any schema object and it just means merge, right? That's pretty close to what this gets to for at least enums.
I mean, the problem if we go in things like argument merging, then you have to think about how that, I mean, we have to specify algorithms for that. It's getting more complicated.
Yeah, it would make the schema extension process for sure more complicated.
Unlike the object types, the enums extensions are normally backwards incompatible. So when you merge multiple enums into one enum, you have potential to break the clients who are already using that enum, because new extra values without notifying the clients will just break them.
Yeah, two thoughts came to mind as I was hearing this. One was what Matt expressed about schema extensions are essentially a intentionally crippled version of schema merging. It's like we took out a lot of the problems that happen when you try to merge schemas by limiting what you can do with extensions. This is one of the things that I think was not necessarily intentional, but was a side effect of that as a limitation. And the other, I think I saw in the chat from Benji, that you would see a similar issue. Like if we were to allow this on enums, then I would expect that behavior to be available in most other places. But I think things get a lot more complicated. Like imagine if you wanted to apply a directive to an argument of a field. Does that mean that you must also list all of the other arguments that field has? And if you don't, does that imply removal of them or an inability to merge? Or what happens if the underlying type were to evolve on the schema in some way such that what you were trying to say was, here's the path to the thing I want to add a directive to, but an evolution of the schema caused something orthogonal to that to not be mergeable. I think there's like a domain of things that are potentially foot gunny in that space.
Yep. I wonder if schema coordinates is useful here for somehow. I'm not quite sure exactly how, but it feels like precisely locating a thing in the schema to then modify in some way might be able to use that.
I see a hand raised.
It's also sorry. Yeah, what I just sent in the chat, it could be more like a patch that as you just said, with specific coordinates, and then that thing would be a bit more, wouldn't need to re-specify all the context that Lee just mentioned. Yeah.
Anyway. One way to get around the complexities of merging is to just say that if your definition has to be identical. So like if this was to work for like say fields and you have different arguments, say you just have to like define the whole field verbatim plus your directives. For enums, that's obvious because there's no fields or arguments or anything. It's the same, it's the same thing. But in any case, you still run into another issue where then it makes it impossible to remove that thing from the original schema. Like you add an enum, you want to add a directive to it in this extension, and then they're kind of like locked to each other in a sense. We've run into that with when we do federation. We have types that are in different services, and sometimes they're in so then they're different ownership, different code bases, and it kind of like it then gets locked in place kind of. So that might be a consideration for doing this with enums.
But I mean, you can reinterpret that today. I mean, you could use extensions and build a custom merge workflow around that. So it's I don't know if it's worth, because that could be quite a complex area that we open up here, and then we define something that in the end will not meet all expectations, right? There will be always this other use case for the schema merging. I think with SDL in place, you can already build these workflows. You just have to define your custom merge logic around that. So I don't know if it's a too big thing to take into the spec.
I think it's worthwhile to back up a sec and answer, like, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? Because I think, and while you suggested a really good motivation for this, but that motivation is not really necessarily about extending schemas. I think you're just leaning on the existing schema extension language as a potential avenue in which to get the problem you're interested in solved, right? Which is supplying additional client-side metadata for some well-known upstream type. Is there other kind of solution angles that you would want to consider exploring that might also address that problem space?
Well, I mean, in our case, the other option would to just not use like GraphQL extensions at all. Like, we will also have like configuration files that are specific to the tool, but yeah, usually we prefer to use the like extensions to the schema. But other than that, I'm not sure.
Well, let's say locally, at least at Meta, we have schema files that are client-only schema files that we have like a custom merge operation for. And that's like, that's not the worst. It clearly isn't like spec compliant, but it's all on the client. So it is like, fine, whatever. But it's annoying that like schema extensions is sort of supposed to give you this power, and it in this one case doesn't. But that's also because the spec can't anticipate all the power everybody needs for all compositions of said power.
Yeah, Matt, you had a mention in the chat. You and Lauren are going back and forth. That I think is the interesting, like, zoomed out version of this, which is, you know, schema diffing, merging, intersecting. Like, there's actually a pretty complicated domain there with different operations that yield different outcomes. And I think part of why extensions feels limited is that it intentionally narrows down the set of that space. But, you know, that's not to say that, like, Matt, what you just described, like, yeah, we just write a type and do some custom merge. That's not necessarily not observant of the spec. The spec just doesn't have much of an opinion there. The schema is there to describe, or the schema language is there to describe what a schema looks like, and the extension tools are there because, you know, people ask for them. I think, looking back, we might consider those, you know, less successful than we had hoped. But another angle on this, Benoit, that may be interesting to explore is to kind of follow Matt's suggestion to see where that takes us, of rather than leaning on the extension syntax and the limitations of it, to just go to the full schema syntax with a custom merge function that's very specific to the needs that the Android client has, that says, given an external schema, which is well known, and given a bunch of things written locally, which include, you know, enums with directives on them, here is the merge function with its own set of restrictions. Mostly because, like, I don't know that this is well explored space, and so I would be hesitant to specify behavior and then end up carving out a whole bunch of domain that is interesting that we can't address. Or worse, make a decision that actually makes those turn into foot guns. And it may be the case that you just have, like, you want the flexibility, like you have something that's just really interesting to the Apollo client that you want to be able to experiment with and explore. And if it's already pre-specified, then that holds your a hand behind your back. And you could consider that sort of design space that, like, if something does feel sort of universal there, then maybe that's a leg into the conversation that Matt's suggesting we have around defining like generalized schema merge rules.
There's another thing that this would be very useful for, which is we do something called schema syncing, where we take the schema file that's on our server, put it over to the client, and then the client can start using it. It would be very, very useful to us if we could say, here's the base, here's like a stack of changes that have happened where each change is atomic and small and like readable and understandable. And you can do that with diff files maybe, but also it might be like that feels close-ish to the same problem. And it might be that that's really what we're all trying to describe that, and it can be boiled down to that problem, but that's a big problem.
Yeah,
it's maybe helpful to distinguish here that like this, what this use case calls for is merging in purely metadata on the graph. We're not actually trying to, like change, anything like from the client standpoint, nothing's changed. And like applying metadata onto the graph it's a problem that we've had also, where like some things you do with directives, you do indirectly, but often there's maybe like different ownership of that metadata. And so like we've built out a whole system just to hold metadata on the graph, and it using basically like schema coordinates that I think Benji mentioned. Maybe there is utility in a more like generalized, standardized way to do that. So it's an easier problem than having to do a true composition, because you're just talking about metadata and you're just saying, I just want to apply this to these types or these enums. So maybe Benji's on something with like the schema coordinates approach.
I want to be sensitive to time. Benoit, do you feel like you've got good feedback and info to rev on this and make some progress?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Yeah, really interesting topic. Okay, we'll use the rest of the time until 5 till the hour to talk about meta fields. We'll start with Yvonne, and then we'll open up to discussion, which will include Roman's number 8 topic. So first, Yvonne, I'll let you kick us off. You're still muted, Yvonne, by the way.
Yeah. So as I was saying during the mute, and I didn't enable the video. Give me a second. Yeah. So situation right now is like we have 2 approaches, both gaining some traction. First is exposing SDL. It's used extensively in Apollo, and but it's not standardized. So SDL exposed through its own top-level field. There is another proposal that gaining traction is exposing directive through introspection. I will talk more about it. And basically, I want to propose third one. I want to know that last time I shared like the slides and added them into agenda. It was like a version 1 of what I'm proposing. After that, I had like internal discussion in Apollo, and also spoke with Benji. And by the way, if you want to know more about different approaches and more in depth, like comparison of them, like Benji did a great talk on a conference, on GraphQL conference on this topic. I think he compared like 5 or 7 different approaches. Here, I would skip SDL1 because if we will go into SDL versus introspection, I think it's an important topic. And at some point, like maybe we actually need to discuss it, especially like Roman raised this question, I think like last time. So, but to keep it short, let's keep it and focused on introspection-based solutions. So, and currently, the dominating approach for exposing like additional metadata through introspection is exposing directives. And problem here, and I think it's actually the main problem, at least for me, directives was designed as kitchen sink for new syntax. So like anything, it can represent anything you want semantically. It's just a syntax without a meaning. Syntax plus validation. And in working group, outside of working group, people use it for like a lot of things. And including like internal things or like schema transformation. For example, here on the slides, you just want to implement fields without repetition. In code first approach, you will write a function. In a ZL approach, you cannot do functions, so you will do directive. And people generate resolvers with directives. For example, Neo4j, like if you're using Neo4j and want to expose this GraphQL, you can basically attach a Neo4j query to a field. So not every directive makes sense. It doesn't make sense to expose all the directives. And like, especially if the transformation and not like metadata itself. Directive are repeatable and chainable. And we explicitly added that like few years ago. And it makes sense. If directive are transformation, it means like if you apply, you need to apply transformation in order. So, and you need to need ability to repeat some transformation multiple times. But for metadata, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it means like if we expose directive, we need to represent it as array, and we cannot like group them. Yeah, because like this requirement for semantic already in spec. Directives argument type as input types. So it basically means like args. We need to expose as array of tuples, name of argument and like a value of argument. We already have a string inside introspection for default value, but it's also not ideal, but at least it's like one instance. Here, like we trying to build entire like metadata thing on top of string, untyped strings that you need to parse. So, and another thing, directive is not very strong contract, they're optional. It totally makes sense for transformation and other stuff. But without ability to say like every field should have that, we cannot build a strong contract. You cannot depend on something existing. Basically, everything becomes knowable. And from other type systems, we know that if everything is knowable, always knowable, it's like a path to disaster, basically. We need to be sure that something is present. And basically, I like showed how like type, how this proposal for apply directives, how they expose there. And I think it's the best possible way to represent directives inside the introspection with all restrictions that I showed before, but it's create like a bunch of problems and I list them. It's not a, basically it's like introspection itself is first class types and introspection query is first class query. You can subselect, you can deprecate stuff, you can do like a bunch of stuff you can do with GraphQL. Here we're creating like some untyped and thing, and we lose like bunch of benefits of GraphQL itself. Yeah, like name classes. Name classes, people like short names for directives, and there is no mechanism to do like specify by or something. You cannot apply directives on directives. I try to do that, but it's like problematic. And directive optimized for people, SDL directives optimized for person who write SDL, not for person who consume them. Both in case of description and like the overall usability. So I wanted to think how we can solve it and define the requirements. So requirements is based on, mainly is basically like documenting what we have for introspection right now. So you should be able to dump entire introspection. We have it right now. You should be, introspection should be representable in this deal. We already have it, and we should not break that. Metadata should be like first-class citizens as type system, like sub-selection, deprecation, description, and whatever. And it's important for our schema evolution to track like who used what and like deprecate stuff and later remove it if nobody uses that. I think like it's very important in long run if we speak about long-living IPS. So what I was thinking of, if we took analogy from programming languages, and recently in our discussion we use programming languages prior art in discussion. So what if we think about directives as decorators? So they like similar in a sense. And what struck me in TC39 during like directive discussion, it's actually like split it up in decorators and decorator metadata as two different things. And as far as I can see in programming languages, decorators are not preserved. They're just a function that do transformation, including setting metadata. So setting up metadata is like one of type of transformation you can do. And what if we decouple directives from metadata? And we actually have it right now. So if you think about existing directives exposed through introspection, we're doing that. We have deprecate specified by one of and like one of his proposal, but so we represent it as a field inside the introspection, and we represent it as directive in SDL. And it's created pressure. Like last time we discussed experimental directive. Basically, to do something like that, there is a pressure to add that into a spec. Maybe it's a good thing, but at the same time, you cannot put everything into a spec. But I think this mechanism is ideal to have SDL directive, and you can, that is like pass as a field in introspection and print it as directive back. I like that workflow, and I think we need to generalize it. There is like, I describe like a difference between directive and metadata. Directive as we have right now, and metadata is what I'm trying to achieve with this proposal. So the end result, actually, I want something that look like that. You have a metadata attached to every like object inside introspection, field, argument, every new value, everything we expose, and you can query as normal GraphQL query. You can subselect, you can do other things. So I had like this idea a year ago, and the key problem here was how to represent it as SDL. and this is very important. People want to dump stuff in SDL, and I will. With my previous proposal in slides, if anybody looking at it, here's my current proposal. I discussed it inside the company, and I want today to show it. Basically, idea is to create kind of like new type of directive. Like it's not a directive, it's metadata, meaning like no transformation, no changes to validation, nothing. It's just like static metadata. You define it, you specify args, you specify where it's applied, and you specify output type for it. And we will have validation rule that say it should be type should be compatible between input and output. So basically, this metadata is in SDL is representable as you show here on the right side, but in introspection is represented as just a field, as I showed before. So nothing new, and we can. In this case, we can actually say required. We can allow people to require directives. So without require, it's like field is knowable. With required, it means it's not knowable. If you, instead of require, you specify repeatable, you have list of footout. Yeah, I forget the name, to change the name. It's last minute with like version 1 to version, like changing my proposal, so some slides are off. You can specify it in code first approach just as like values, and we apply it input coercion arguments algorithm. We already have it. And moreover, it's like compatible. Since I propose a new symbol, and by the way, like whole credits about plus sign goes to Benji. Benji suggests to use like a plus sign. Plus sign basically mean it's like static. It's not influence anything. It's like just exposed for introspection. It's not change validation, nothing, just exposed for introspection. And more importantly, it's like create its own namespace. So it's not compete with directive. So as transformation period, people can just define directive alongside with new metadata thing. It's basically first class citizen with things, including like you can detect breaking changes if you make something if it's something was required, then become non-required. Yeah, and other benefits. Challenges, basically, you cannot do interfaces, unions, and you cannot do arguments. But I think it's fundamental changes on fundamental restriction on introspection, because you need to be able to dump entire introspection. So in a way, it's similar to what Benji proposed because we discussed it and we split up in opinion. I think, and to save Benji some time and explain what's the difference, Benji proposed to use the same type as input on output and create new types, struct types. And I propose to just have validation algorithms that ensure input type based match output type. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Ivan, just one question. Why did you decide against having the as an extension to a directive, where you can say the directive as this output type?
Yeah, so in original proposal, first, like as makes sense only if directive is exposed, like only if it's metadata. But people use directive for a bunch of things. We can create subclass of directives, but I think it's confusing, and it's especially confusing like in original issue. One of the points that people raised up is ability to distinguish what shared and what not shared, what doesn't share. So people propose different symbol in the first place to address that. So I thought instead of creating like directives with unrestricted syntax with validation, and instead of like creating subset of directives that are more restricted, I decided to do totally new definition. But it's up to discussion with like super early proposals. There is like no draft, nothing. I discussed it here and inside the poll. So it's like RFC -1, I would say, or 0.
What are some examples for stuff you would want to expose as metadata? Because for me, this is like very abstract right now with the foo and tag.
Yeah. So I will. So basically, Apollo have like its own. Basically, like Apollo Federation is good example. Like bunch of like validation constraint is good example. Like we think for a naming alternative name for Enum types is like something that you want to expose. Basically, anything like UI names for Enums. Some people want to have emojis. Enums map Enums to emojis and other things. But key thing here is like represent metadata that accessible by client. Yeah, sorry, I missed that part. I tried to squeeze, so instead of like discussing the whole RFC why I need that, I focused on discussing mechanism. Basically, like original issue provide description of why this mechanism is needed.
For example, if you think about like custom mappings for clients, I don't see why this shouldn't just be a field that returns the thing in the formatted thing. I don't see why you would need to expose this as metadata, to be honest, because then the client would have to fetch all the metadata, like a huge list of emoji mappings or whatever. So to me, it seems more simple to just have the field export the value that you want to use on the front end instead. But yeah, it does not seem like a use case where this would fit to me.
Yeah, so
I'm going to call a time check just so we make sure we have time for a break. We're not going to stop discussion on this though, so we'll come back after the break and keep going on this since I know we want to have an additional 5 or 10 minutes. So take a quick break, stretch your legs, use the bathroom. We'll come back here on the hour and pick up where we left off.
Yeah, and I will share a link to presentation in chat.
Awesome. Add a link to the agenda file too, if you can.
Yeah, it's the same in the agenda file.
All right, we'll get things going again. Good, everyone back. Okay, where were we? Yvonne, you just led us through your presentation deck. Roman, I know you wanted to reserve specifically 5 minutes to dig into sort of a counter proposal. So maybe we can hand it to you to talk through that. Then we can open the floor again.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me, guys?
Yeah, loud and clear.
I hope you do. You see my screen?
Not yet.
Applied directive.
Not yet.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yep.
Yep.
So basically, it's not a counter proposal. It's just counter arguments to some arguments for meta fields, meta types, and against applied directives approach. So my biggest problem, actually, my biggest concern with all this is not the features of the meta fields, meta classes by themselves, but the other concern, the background of this whole issue. So if we go with something like this in the future, what we'll have? We'll have two metadata facilities, right? Because directives don't go anywhere. So users, first readers, when reading the spec, will immediately recognize this. Oh, they have directives, which is metadata and recognized as metadata facility, and also this meta thing. I think directives are immediately associated with the known facilities in other languages. And even for Java, annotations is literally identical in syntax, not only in semantics, but in syntax to directives with @ and so on. So basically, and it's used when you look at, for example, deprecated or include skip, they're used for the same purposes. So from experience, 20 years in .NET or a little less in Java or another language, these facilities there were very successful. People do all kinds of things in .NET, from simple labels to the whole aspect-oriented programming, you know, doing transactions, calling some tracing, login methods, and all that stuff. And everybody went very well. So on the other hand, it's the concept is already known, familiar to users, and it's, I would say, even for new users, very straight and simple. Compared to this, meta types seem a little bit more complicated. For example, I couldn't quite make sense of this screen with example of definition of the previous presentation. So basically, my concern is this. So why didn't we go with directives? We have to at the end explain to readers why didn't we go with the directives, since it was very good for other platforms. With meta types, it seems to me some of the problems we don't solve, we just move them. Like, for example, input and so on, sorting, organizing them, and so on. And one of the things I see when you define extension, a meta type as extension of standard meta type, then you have plain list. And imagine the situation of like Netflix, what they have like 100 teams. Instead of so each team, instead of defining their own directive, they will go and add the field in this meta field type. I see a huge contention there. Just one of the comments. Now, with arguing against applied directives, I would say that most, if all of the arguments don't really work for me. Directives are limited in this way. So from .NET, attributes are also very limited. They don't allow many things allowed in regular code, but still they work okay. Now the directive word comes up, and is used as what it should be, since directive is a kind of call for action. I think the word is irrelevant and it's historical accident. Which platform picked what word for the facility? Returning arg values, the problem with the input types as output types and untyped types. So this is the same as with meta types. The suggested solution is to return string, which is the same as here. So we have to resolve it in any way. And first of all, structs might help. And also, I think we should look at untyped things, or any and map. As Lee, you often say, show me the real world example. So here is the real world example in our own kind of spec. And believe me, this happens in real world applications all the time. And I know there are attempts in specific implementations to add at least map scalar. Then there is example in Benji's presentation. The problem if there are too many directives, he gives the example labels for multiple languages. It's not the case usually. It's in based on .NET, the number of directives is very limited. If it is, it's never 100. If you have a reasonable developer, reasonably competent. Now I want to address very quickly another counter argument against the directives, that as a fact, there are directives in real world schemas that contain some secrets. So I think it's completely wrong, and the wrong way we are kind of addressing it. So here is the logic of thinking SDL file is a development artifact, right? Like source code, like everything else, where it should live in Git repo. Can we have secrets in Git repo? The answer is definite no. And we know that's not some special security practice. That's absolutely accepted truth. No secrets in Git repos. Git repos leak, get hacked, and so on. So many people get access there. So secrets should live somewhere else, in secret vaults and so on. As a conclusion, SDL file should not contain any secrets, which means that if somebody comes to us and says, oh, I cannot expose my directives because I have secrets there, we would, instead of saying, oh yeah, that's a concern, we should reply, no, stop doing this. This is terrible practice. So this should not be a concern for us. And at the end, even if developer doesn't want to remove, their filtering them in introspection calls is absolutely trivial. So my conclusion and suggestion, we should explore applied directives to the very end, maybe in parallel with the meta fields or whatever else, for the reasons I just said, because it is very similar to other facilities in other platforms. For most users coming here, they will be associated, and that will be for them expected way to go, and very confusing if we introduce something else. And finally, also, there is still hanging problem role of SDL, because we are kind of a catch-22, a chicken and egg problem here still. So formally, where these directives are coming from, which should be shown by introspection, because it looks like by definition, introspection is a source of truth. SDL can be only generated from introspection, right? Then where all the directives can come from at all? Anyway, so, and this relates to one of the my other kind of topic theme about role of SDL which we will kind of clear up, which actually shows up everywhere, including this particular topic. That's all for me. Thank you.
Rather than opening it up, I want to be, thank you for that, Roman, by the way. I really agree with a lot of the ideas and problem statements from both of those two presentations. Rather than opening it for discussion, I want to be respectful of the rest of our agenda time. My advice for moving this forward, there's more problems being uncovered than there is solution space being explored. I think we ought to have two things. One is a discussion thread where we can start teasing through all of these things async. Yvonne, if I can tap you to open up that in the discussions board for WG, you guys can share, Roman and you can share your presentations there, and we can go from there, starting to explore. The second that might be helpful is to have a breakout meeting similar to what we've been doing for the composite schemas, just so we can have like much more time and dedicated space to really dig into this. I think there's a lot here, and we just don't have enough time in these overall meetings to get as much in the weeds as we need to. So that would be my advice for moving forward. But thank you both for the presentations. I'm very compelled that there's something at the end of all this journey, but we got to get through there.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Concern, like, let's focus. Yeah, I agree. It's like it's bigger topic, but since there is like, I don't want to create a like one huge meta discussion about everything. So, like, is it safe to say we have two separate issues? We can like orthogonal to each other. One is introspection versus SDL thing, and second is extending introspection with additional metadata.
Yeah,
I'm like, personally, I'm interested in second one.
They are intertwined, to Roman's point, to the degree that it's
I want to insist, bringing in SDO here. SDO, yes, it's different. So let's focus simply on introspection.
Yeah,
and
so
how we return
that's
metadata.
wise.
Yeah.
There's probably both. But point being, I think we ought to bring this async, open as many separate discussion threads as you think are warranted. If that's what Yvonne,
I have already.
Them.
I have already regarding SDO.
Yeah, so
discussion.
I will open a second thread, and as I think to go somewhere, we need to use the same approach as one-off.
Yeah,
but restricted. Like, I don't think we would abandon introspection in any case. So, like, for me, requirement is any solution should be compatible, 100% compatible between SDL and introspection. So, and I will put it in like list of requirements, and basically question here, can we, especially since we already have like three proposals, basically like apply directive, what I'm proposing, and like similar to what Benja proposing, but with like I think our proposal is like similar, it's different in the way typing is handled. So what I'm asking is a step forward is to scope it in a sense of how to expose that thing in introspection and represent an SDL, have a list of requirements and have competing solutions similar to what we have for one-off.
I think that's smart. But I'll let you take that offline. I think that's a smart way to go about it, Yvonne. And hopefully we'll have some progress there to talk about next time. But I want to be respectful of time. I think we're probably gonna have to bump some agenda topics because that one. Fair amount over.
Can we optimize the agenda a bit? I think like I'm okay to switch into other topic. I just propose instead of having some topics like Benji, what Benji added into agenda is see more, and I think it would be faster if now we discuss like Benji topic without like going out of context.
Which topic is that?
Struct typing.
Yeah, struct typing.
I mean,
Just
it's
to
not
be
similar,
clear.
but it's totally different. But you could solve a couple of things in introspection with it. So it's not
Yeah, the struct topic is much broader than just metadata.
In
so
that
yeah.
case, in that case.
That's a big topic. Let's see if we can get through some of the ones that are scoped for a little bit less time first. All right, Yakov, I'm gonna hand it to you to talk about resolve abstract type.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. I'm gonna try to dump into the chat. First of all, I'm gonna try to keep it brief. I'm gonna try to dump into the chat the link to the pull request. Okay, so basically we have a step within our execution algorithm in which we need to resolve the abstract type to a concrete type. And we, at some point, I can't remember how long ago it was now, we at some point have allowed interfaces to implement other interfaces. Might it be more than a year ago? Could be. So the question, this started from, I forget exactly, but we can follow the links. It started from a request on the GraphQL JS implementation, reference implementation, to allow interfaces which currently provide a method to do this resolving. And the spec just says each system should provide some sort of internal method. The request was to allow interfaces that implement other interfaces to set up a chain so that the interface, the method that resolves that abstract type could resolve it as another intermediate abstract type. And then that method's, that abstract type's resolve abstract type would be called. And so the question becomes, and that's why I linked to the spec text, is whether we think that that needs to be a specific change within our specification. And so if you take a look at the attached pull request, it basically adds a step to the algorithm with some very helpful edits by Benji, so that instead of the algorithm saying that we just directly call that internal method, we explicitly say that internal method could resolve to an interface, to another abstract type, and it should, and then we can recursively call it. And this is that's basically the question. In implementing the functionality within GraphQL JS, we can implement it without any change in the spec. I think that I'm not too familiar at all, really, with how this is done in other languages. It was my gut feeling that this change or this feature wouldn't require a change in the spec text, but there were other opinions that maybe it would. So that's about it. Throw it out to the group as to whether we think that this, and please ask questions if I haven't explained this well enough, but it's a much narrower issue than the weighty issues we've been discussing so far.
Yeah, I have to share your question. Why does this require a change to the spec? Because if you were to run this internally as a recursive algorithm where interface A resolves to interface B, which resolves to interface C, which resolves to concrete type D, an outside observer still sees interface A resolve to concrete type D, which is the required algorithm. So what's actually the observed change here?
So, I guess the question is whether there is, I don't think there is an observed change. The question, it's like sort of an additional feature. I guess the question is, do we want that additional, by adding it to the spec, we'd say that every implementation has to sort of allow it. And I'm not sure if that's it makes sense. I mean, I just don't know because I don't really do anything outside of TypeScript, JavaScript. So I don't really know if that makes sense to add it in every language. So I guess, well, yeah, so I mean, that's the question. In the implementers group, I guess we raised this as a potential blocker for this feature. And so we wanted feedback on whether it actually is necessary or not.
Other thoughts?
And we can certainly get the feedback offline. I don't want to take too much time away from all the other weighty things. But it is currently a blocker for a feature.
But what concrete feature is blocked? That I don't get. That you can specify fragments on other interfaces that are in the inheritance chain or what? Because that is already possible. Or I mean, we can already...
So when we're executing, we have a step in which we need to resolve that abstract type. So if we have a chain in which we're resolving a couple different levels, we want to be able to follow that change. We can currently do it with a few code changes in the reference implementation. Just the question is whether we need to change the spec to specifically support that. Again, I didn't think we needed to, but I guess I needed confirmation before I could get my PR merged from the group. So that's why we're here.
So I guess if I understand correctly, what you're saying is you would like a feature change to GraphQL.js that allows this recursive behavior, and the GraphQL.js maintainers aren't in full agreement that can just be added without a spec change because it would no longer directly reflect what the spec represents. Is that accurate?
I'm not sure. Ivan was on the other side. I don't know if he's still on the call and wants to weigh in. I think that's an accurate summary, but seeing as he's here, maybe he might want to add something to it.
Yeah, so actually, as feedback on this, because spec text is very exact. It's like say you should have a type should resolve to concrete type, and the reference implementation done like that. I don't think it's language dependent in a sense, because spec is not language dependent. Spec say abstract type should have a function to resolve to concrete type. Now we basically in reference implementation we're saying abstract type can resolve not to a type, but to another abstract type, and this abstract type will have a function to resolve to some abstract type, and in the end of the chain you should have a concrete type. So I don't see any language dependent thing here. So question for me is we want it in general, and it should be added to GraphQL.js or not. I don't see why C# difference between JavaScript and C# in what sense, both implementation have function to resolve type. It's a question if this function can return only concrete type or another abstract type and create a chain.
But what I'm not clear on is why do you need that abstract type? Because what we do, we in Hot Chocolate we generate an execution plan, right, at the end, and that in that execution plan we always resolve to concrete types. So every fragment that you have on an abstract type is in the end resolved to a concrete type, or because in execution we only have concrete types.
Yeah, it's right. So question here is that this jump from abstract type to concrete, from a field type to concrete type is one step, or you are allowed to do a hierarchy. You can do a hierarchy in type system right now. And in spec, we say every abstract type should have a function to resolve to concrete type. A question here, if you have a pet, a mammal, and cat and dog, it's our favorite example with animals. So a question here, right now we require pet to resolve to cat and dog. You cannot, pet cannot resolve to mammal, and mammal cannot decide like what it wants to resolve. People ask it probably for modularity, but yeah, I'm like, it's added complexity. We adding with added complexity to reference implementation. If we add with added complexity to reference implementation, basically say everybody else should replicate it. If everybody else should replicate it, it's more or less the same as we put it in a spec.
Yeah. But I don't see the need for it. Is it not a utility function that you want to have? Because why should we make it multiple steps? At the moment, you can optimize this resolve concrete type to whatever, but then you would have to do multiple steps.
Yeah, I have the same thought of like, this seems like it adds, anytime we add recursion, we add the possibility for infinite recursion or long-lived recursion. It's like it becomes a reliability or even at worst an attack vector. Is an alternative here to give people utilities to make this possible within so the spec language is that there's a general function that does this resolution, which calls a internal method. And that internal method, GraphQL.js represents, and others do as well, as sort of a method provided by each type. But there's no reason why that method on that type couldn't call that same internal method on another type, right? Basically do the recursion, but do the recursion within the internal method rather than outside of it.
Yeah, it's exactly a point of treating it like is internal implementation. My question here is that as a maintainer of GraphQL, as we discussed it in GraphQL.js as a whole group, I'm like, I feel everything we merge, we encourage other people to do the same. So on that point, I'm like, I don't think it's like strictly necessary. So treating it, providing some other utility functions that don't create recursion in execution, I'm like, I definitely, if it can be so like that, I'm definitely for that. But we have an issue.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, but we have this issue and we have a PR, and I want to have objective criteria, like to say yes or no. And as you correctly say, it's a recursion, it's a complexity. So, and especially like for me, GraphQL.js being a reference implementation, de facto, it's like GraphQL Python is a clone of GraphQL.js. A lot of other implementation do the same. Like Python version, like clone commit by commit. So in a sense, be deciding if anybody want to create like implementation for other languages, the first step usually, first implementation is clone of GraphQL.js. So if this complexity worth adding or not, like maybe okay, we maybe not add to a spec, but I want to like ask group if it's worth it or not, because I'm not sure and I don't have objective criteria to say no. Like Yakov's PR, technically we have like some disagreement about name of function and other refactoring which we can solve like internally, but other than that, I don't have any reason to say no without having discussion.
I would just add that in terms of the recursion issue, there's some text, the text spec that spec text that I have could probably be improved. The current version of the PR doesn't allow recursion because it checks to make sure that that the interface return is an appropriate member of the chain. And since we can't have cycles within the interfaces, we won't run into that problem. But I do agree that we're basically implementing utility that could be solved in user land. the question, and so the question is, should we, you know, I guess go forward? I don't think we have any concerns though about levels of recursion there.
Okay. I'm a bit on the fence, but Jakob, what you just said pushes me in the direction of thinking that this might be reasonable. I don't think we have to come to a conclusion right now, and maybe it's worthwhile to bring this, just use this as a flag to pull feedback back to your PR and the spec text. Specifically limiting it to like no one type could just delegate to any other arbitrary type to recurse. It has to be an implemented interface. That seems like that limits the infinite recursion threat, and it also reduces the scope, and hopefully gives us tools to help make the developer experience quite reasonable. So with that constraint in mind, I will give you some feedback on your PR about some ideas that I have, and I encourage other folks to do the same. So no explicit conclusion here, but we'll gather more thoughts and try to move it forward.
Awesome.
Okay, next up, Benji is going to give us an update on GraphQL over HTTP.
Hey folks, I'm going to keep this real short because we're running short on time. Oh great, that link's broken. That's wonderful. But effectively, the GraphQL over HTTP working group, we now have resurrected. It kind of went into hiatus for a period of time, but it feels like it's time to bring it out, dust it off, and get it ready to ship, potentially. I'd like to do that actually quite soon, preferably with the next version of GraphQL spec itself. So with that in mind, I spent a large number of hours going through and effectively doing some very heavy editing to the specification itself. We have had a GraphQL over HTTP working group meeting where we've discussed that. One of the main things about this change is there was a lot of contention over this content type. So media types. There's an issue with GraphQL as it currently stands when you use JSON as the way of talking in both directions, that we can't trust errors if they don't have a 200 or a 2xx status code. And that's because those errors or that data from the response could come from an intermediary server. It could come from a proxy or, you know, something like Cloudflare, something on the edge, whatever. And as such, we can't trust it unless it's 200, in which case we know it hasn't been tampered with. So what we've effectively proposed is that we add this application / GraphQL plus JSON content type. So if you have that type on the response, then you know it's definitely GraphQL and you can trust it, even if it's a 500 or a 400 or whatever else. So that's one of the changes versus the status quo for this specification. Everything else is basically just us saying, here is the status quo. Here's what people have been doing in the wild for the last 7 years. And let's actually write this down so that we know exactly what we're doing and what the strict rules are on everything. So we have that. What we've proposed is that there's effectively a watershed. We didn't want to make anyone incompliant when we first launched this. So the idea is that on the 1st of January 2025 at exactly midnight UTC, this rule would come into effect. Date can be changed, of course. But effectively, I'm giving everyone 2 years, 2.5 years to implement this media type on responses. After that time, JSON will still be supported, so it's still non-breaking, but everyone is recommended to use the application GraphQL JSON type, and that will then mean that error codes will be valid. So that is one of the broad changes. We've also gone through, looked at restructuring, we've discussed with various parties. We still have more feedback coming in from Apollo and from Dennis regarding the SSE and the WebSockets. Those will not be going into version 0, but we want to make sure that whatever we do with version 0 shouldn't have to break too much if and when we do add those other things. That was the bulk of that. The other thing is we are restarting meetings. I am aiming to do another meeting in the next couple of weeks, because I would like to present something to you, the working group, next month, hopefully, of here is a spec, what do you think, kind of thing. So maybe wait a week, and then eyes on this spec would be ideal. So yeah, basically we're asking for feedback, for input now would be more useful than input later. And a reminder that the aims are to basically specify what is already the case, and that we're only dealing with queries and mutation operations, not subscription operations.
Very exciting. What's your call to action? What do you need from us right now?
Well, I would like to, as I say, present this next month. So I think anyone who's really interested in this topic, now's the time to get re-involved. We've not done a brilliant job of bringing everyone back in. It was just anyone who was monitoring that particular repo. So get involved. And the other thing is, yeah, if people can cast their eyes over it just before the next working group, maybe a week before or something like that, that would be very valuable. Do we have a target for the next GraphQL spec cut, Lee?
No, not necessarily, but we've been, historically, we've tried to do them roughly once per year. So I think that's probably where we will end up this time as well. Let me remind myself.
Was it October, the last one?
Yeah, we did October. Yeah, I think it's probably the right place for us to aim is October. We've done that. A couple of them have been in October.
Okay, so from your point of view, Lee, if you could chase up all the relevant legal things that we would need to do, because I know that that's associated with spec releases, we'll need that for the over HTTP one. That would be ideal, or at least let me know what needs to be done if I can do it. And yeah, we just want to push this forward and get a first version of it out.
The biggest piece is getting the contributions agreement signed for everyone who's contributed to it. I think that was the thing that took the most time to cut the last version of the spec.
Yeah.
And since this repo has existed for a long time, we may have to do some bookkeeping to make sure that we've got that, but I can help out.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. That's it. I think we should probably move on.
Awesome. Thank you for the update. I want to shift things around in the agenda a little bit, just because there's been a fair amount of stuff going on with defer and stream, and I want to make sure that for sure we don't miss that. So Rob, if you don't mind taking it from there, I'll edit the agenda to reflect the order shift.
Yes, just going to share 1 second. So the last couple of meetings, we've talked about batching in general. And so this is specifically now for batching of payloads that return from defer and stream. And the problem we're trying to solve here is you execute a query that could potentially issue a large number of payloads for defer and or stream, which could overwhelm your client, causing like a loop of rerenders. So the last time we talked about it, I think there was general consensus that we do want to have some sort of batching. Basically what we have right now is, if we're speaking in JavaScript, JS types, the execution result could be your standard result, or it could be a async generator of the payload types that we have previously defined. The downside with this is if there are a lot of payloads that are ready, we're basically adding the delay of the execution event loop cycle, which maybe would have to be compensated for with an additional delay of debouncing on the client side or network, something like that. We also talked, should we just always return an array of these payloads? Whichever payloads are ready, return an array of them. there was a little bit of pushback here because it could be considered kind of a weird API that you're yielding a list of things instead of one single thing. We also discussed, could it just return one payload or an array of payloads? I think a problem with this is that if you're using an untyped language, you might not think that these arrays are coming in and write code that could fail when it does see an array. Then there was another suggestion, I think from Yvonne, which was basically return an object with an incremental property and have this incremental be a list of all the payloads. That would also let us move the has next property to the outer object instead of being on each individual payload. So we had talked with Matt from Meta and some other people at the GraphQL conference, and it seems like we were mostly aligning on this approach, option D. What this also means is that the initial results could look something like this, where your initial data, errors, data, has next are here, and then further payloads could also be delivered with the initial result on this incremental property. So yeah, just wanted to hear if there's any other thoughts on that, or if we think this is something that we could move forward with.
Is the incremental property always there, or only in the case that you have more than one?
I think it would always be there. So it will always be there on subsequent payloads. On the initial payload, it may be there.
I see. So the idea is that every single non-initial payload, rather than having a data field, has this incremental field, which supplies you the list of objects that are the incremental additions.
Right. And I think that another point that Yvonne was going for with this is that the type definition of the response is a little bit more consistent, where these like defer stream payloads are always under this property, and they're not really the same thing as an initial payload anymore.
I just would point out that that does intersect with the questions we've been having about whether defer and stream behavior is a must or a should. I think with Yvonne's point, to paraphrase him, I think he's still on, but I think his point was also that we can switch to a must with this format.
I still would say let's keep it a should, because I also saw, I mean, we are exploring that the same than Apollo is at the moment. So what they are looking at the federation, they cannot always defer. So they can only defer if it's done on entity sections. So having it a must complicates things.
Yeah, I'll call out with must versus should. Where we had landed previously was on should, meaning that clients need to accept that a server may not put it there. And I think the strongest reason for doing that is that if that's totally the wrong decision, we could change to must in a non-breaking way, because all the clients will still work, but we can't ever go the other way. So, but I would like to keep the discussion not on must for sure, but on this payload response format.
But yeah, but
I think to focus it then, where if the server is choosing not to honor defer on some later payload, sorry, on this first payload, then we can, then incremental might appear, might not appear, or would all the data just appear on the first, just be delayed and sent together? Meaning, how would that intersect with this new format?
I think the must versus should is whether the defer directive is ignored entirely and it's not delivered incrementally, versus if it is being honored and there are multiple ready at the same time, or they're ready with the initial payload they would be under?
I think that that is a good middle ground. Like if we have this incremental property, so when I read through that, I thought that's actually a good middle ground, because if you do not defer, so if your server decides to do not defer, you still put it in the incremental property, and for the client, it doesn't have a change. So you get the same patches that you would get with the proper, if defer would be a must, but the server still can. They just take it in this first initial call.
I don't think defer could ever be a must, because there exists a whole host of clients out there that don't have this implemented that definitionally then will ignore that directive. And the moment we say that this is a must, immediately will be breaking. So I think we have to be a should for backwards compatibility with all servers that either don't or don't want to implement this behavior.
Well, wouldn't it be a client? If a client sends only, defer now, the server should reject it because it's an undefined directive.
It's but I know what you mean, Lee. I think because if we introduce it now as a should, we cannot go to a must. Or no, because like backwards compatible clients have no problem because they don't send the defer in. So we cannot break them from the server, even if we make it a must, because only once the client sends that in. So it shouldn't.
I think there might be a little confusion in the discussion. I think the should must here is whether if the server supports the stream and defer directives, whether it must then honor them, rather than that the stream and defer must be supported.
I think even in that case, it goes against another principle, which is that the clients should not be in the business of specifying how a server should behave. They should be in the business of demanding what they need. And then the server should take that information to decide what the best way is to produce that. So if a client says you must defer at this boundary, especially if it's going to deliver it in a format that assumes that the client will like assemble those steps and render it in one pass because it's delivered in a single payload, then all that's doing is tying the server's hand behind its back. Like maybe that server is taking a significant performance hit in pausing there to resume something else, and it could have just been faster to just not defer it in the first place and leave it in line, especially if the client's behavior is to merge all the rental pieces back in.
I agree 100% with that. That's why I also want to keep it a should. Especially in schema stitching, distributed schemas is an area where it could be very beneficial to not defer in certain cases.
Yeah, but anyhow, we're to Rob's point, we're getting off topic. He wants to talk about this this format.
I mean, I guess with this format, I'm just questioning if the incremental tag does appear, does that mean that? I mean, we should just be cognizant of the fact that this the server has the prerogative currently of sometimes sometimes honoring the directive and sometimes not. Usually it should, but sometimes yes and sometimes no. So I think we should just be clear that the existence of the incremental tag doesn't mean that the data payload only contains what's included within within the initial request. So it doesn't really help for the typings issue. That's the only point that I'm making, because that's not unless we change unless we go this extra leg and go from should to must. That's why I'm bringing it up here.
Since I suggested that that format in first place to address this should versus must, not to provide discussion, but to provide point why I suggested in the first place, is that imagine client right now receive initial response and it receive has next true. So it needs to know, should it what parts of it truly return and what's not, without saying must. We basically say client need to go inside the data know all possible locations and should go inside the data and check if it's there or not, if this defer or this stream is finished or not. I think it's like extra work of client looking inside. The whole idea of a feature is incremental rendering, meaning client should know if this part is finished or not. And now by making it optional, we're saying, like, if it's inside the initial payload, you forced to supply it in incremental, client don't need to inspect data recursively. But without that, client can ignore, for example, it can ignore defer, but implement stream, or vice versa. And we in situation where client need to check in incremental and also need to check data in order to understand what data is fully delivered and ready to be rendered.
I also see use cases where the server could decide to send the execution result as a whole. For example, if you think about GraphQL cache, then if you execute a deferred or streamed response the first time and it might be slow, then it makes sense to stream it through. But once the gateway can cache it and then has the whole execution result immediately for the client, why would it stream those if it can send the whole execution result at once and it would be way faster?
This is basically that proposal. So like, why I propose this format in the first place? It does exactly what you're talking about. For example, if you're caching, you're basically saying multiply payloads into one. You not need to, like, on this cache layer, you don't need to patch. Idea here is, like, from performance point of view, a server can still decide if it's sent in one package or in multiply. It just shape is the same. If person say, if client says stream or defer, it means like it should be delivered in patch format in the same payload or subsequent payload, but shape is, so we have strong types basically, like we have a guarantees on how data look like and how incremental look like.
Do the clients that currently implement defer and stream require the result being returned in the way they expect it, like in chunks, or would they also be okay with getting the whole result as one batch? Or would that have any implications if it would be an array of patches versus the whole result already merged to the final state?
Yeah, I know that Relay supports giving it an array of payloads, and it will do one React render with that data after all the payloads are written to the store. I can't say if there's a difference between that versus them not being in the prior payload, but I think that this is useful for other scenarios. Like, let's say you have a query that returns an array of objects and there's a defer under that object. That would be one payload for every element that's in that array. And it may not be ready initially with the initial result, but maybe a lot of them are ready at the same time. So you could do that in one re-render instead of, and doesn't really come into the play of should versus must, because you don't have the prior, you're not putting it onto a prior payload, you're just delivering several unrelated results at the same time.
It seems like the key value here that makes your option D more interesting than option C is the fact that the initial payload also has the ability to do this, because like batching multiple incremental payloads as a array payload still means that your initial payload has to stand alone. So this gives us the ability to have an initial payload and incremental payloads come as a single chunk, which especially for something like a CDN that's collecting this and then giving it to you in a different set of chunks seems like a worthwhile thing to allow. There's the separate question of whether we require this form for a defer directive or not, which sounds like it's still open. But I don't know, it seems like we're coming to consensus that this form is right.
But you mean it by being in this form, that's like,
yeah,
instead of
the essential to force, like if you put a defer on a fragment, that you have to put it in incremental, even if you as a service say ignore it, ignore the defer, don't do the defer. And the main reason for forcing this into the shape is actually so the client knows what is coming. Like typically, that's also what we do in the .NET client. We use the label, kind of an indicator that this section of data is there for this fragment. But actually, that is a crutch for not having fragment modularity, because then you wouldn't need to do that. So
I see.
Yeah, the key insight here that I remember from the conference was like, we defer actually changes the response shape that the client is expecting. And if we don't require things to end up in incremental, then we're saying the client needs to support both possible response shapes. Whereas this, like in everything else we do, we say there's one response shape. The client has specified the response shape and the server is guaranteed to give you that shape.
I'm still slightly concerned about the potential for a real performance degradation from that, which I'll be honest is just like a theoretical concern. But I don't know, Matt, maybe you probably have more experience than the rest of us since you guys have been exploring this in Relay for a while against a real service.
So I'm relatively, I'm not 100% confident, but I do not believe that in practice we ever like don't defer. We do provide multiple defer payloads in like the same network response. We don't even use arrays, it's just like bytes coming down, but whatever. But I believe we have not seen real problems with splitting up at those boundaries, but I might be wrong.
The high level sense I have is to like when a service might decide that it wants to ignore defer for performance reasons is one where the deferred fragment heavily overlaps with fields that are not deferred. They're all either like prefetched and hot in cache, or they're all derived values. It's just like trivially cheap to fetch it and return it. Where like maybe you'll regain some of that, but you know, even in the payload, you could be duplicating things, right? Your deferred fragment could have a field that is the value of which is already replaced or already spit out somewhere else.
Yeah,
But
to some extent, I think it's the client's responsibility to not ask for a duplicative shape like that if it cares about that performance.
Yeah, that's tricky for the modularization reasons, but again, these topics have gotten a little intertwined. There's another topic you want to hit, right, Rob?
Yeah, before we move on, I just want to just restate what I think that we're saying to make sure I'm on the same page. When we're saying should versus must, that means that a client is sending a query that has a defer or a stream, and if the server decides to ignore it because that's allowed, because it's only a should recommendation and not a must, that means that the response is going to be not inside of its own incremental payload. And so there's not going to be one of these incremental payloads delivered. It will be in whatever the parent payload is. That could be the initial payload or another defer or stream payload. And we're saying that all incremental payloads should be delivered inside of this incremental wrapper. And the initial payload may, using RFC definition of may, also include an incremental wrapper for the case of any deferred payloads that potentially are ready at that time. Is that correct?
I think so,
Yes.
yeah. I
Yeah.
think we're not settled yet on the must versus should, but this form of having a specific incremental key as an array seems like the right direction, since it explicitly allows you to include it in the initial payload, whereas our previous mode did not allow that. That does seem quite useful. The only like nitpicky thing I have with it, which is probably not that big a deal, is that for the typical case where an incremental payload is a single thing being added, there's just a lot of like JSON junk surrounding the data. And I have like a slight worry about the overhead of that, but
yeah, for sure. I do think that the case of there being more than one is not the typical case, but I think it's more common than an edge case.
Yeah.
And I do want to get one last word in on should versus must. I think that the most important reason that we should stick with should is that will force clients to understand that if they defer something, it may not be deferred. And if we decide that's a terrible idea, then we could have another RFC and change it to must, and that's no problem. No clients will be broken, and new clients won't need to have that overhead of figuring it out. But if we start out with must now and need to change to should, then there's going to be clients out there that will demand that if they defer something, they have to get an incremental payload back. So I mean, I'm a little bit on the fence too. I don't know if maybe must is a really good idea, but I feel like that should be in its own RFC after this lands, where it could be argued on its own merit. Okay, and I know that we're almost out of time. So if I could get async feedback on this one, this is basically, Yvonne brought up, we have these fields defined: data, errors, label, path, has next. Defer payloads, data is always an object or null. Stream payloads, data is always an array or null. For typing purposes, should we change the name of data to items? That will make it more clear. Is it a stream payload or a defer payload? Or are we diverging these types unnecessarily? I don't have like a super strong opinion, but would like to get other thoughts.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah, these are the last two issues that I have open for defer and stream as of right now. So I'm hoping that with some feedback on this, I could get the spec PR up to date and ready for review for next month.
Oh boy. Thanks again for all of your hard work on this, Rob. This is a huge change. So
yeah,
call to action for everyone to drop it on this. This is important to get this piece right too. I know we're out of time. We had two more agenda items, Roman and Benji. If you guys wouldn't mind opening discussion threads for those and tagging folks that you want to pull feedback from. And if there's still stuff to resolve before the next meeting, then we'll make sure those get higher up on the agenda for next time.
Okay, just one thing before we go. I'm considering struct as a potential replacement for one of. So anyone who's implementing one of at the moment, just a heads up on that.
Yeah, I already implemented it. It's already in the version, but it is as experimental. So it's the second thing I implemented. I started with input union, but that's a risk. That's a risk. It's okay.
Well, Benji will make sure to give you ample time earlier in the agenda next time, and hopefully an extra month to bake the ideas around and pull feedback gives you a more robust presentation to the rest of the group.
That's good.
Cool.
Okay, 1 second. So my short presentation was actually call for commenting on discussions. I already did open discussions and posted them. It's about formal GraphQL definition and the order of chapters. I think they are kind of basic foundational for all other issues, and consequences come up with the issues that we discussed today about role of SDL as well. Another thing, Lee, you said we are done with the first portion of fixes, right? So I can start delivering the rest of them.
Yeah, feel free to open pull requests or anything editorial. If you wouldn't mind adding to the agenda a link to the discussion, just so that it's easy to lose track.
Okay, yeah, I will.
And we'll dig into that.
Thank you.
Too. Cool. All right, folks. Thank you for sticking with us as we go a little bit over time, and for all of the healthy discussion. See you all soon.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.